Well, hello there. Long time no see. Welcome to my video series that I have been calling Crime Dive. My name is Crystal Sky, and if you're anything like me, you find yourself drawn to true crime cases. Not sure what it is, but yeah, if you're anything like me, you can't help but be drawn to true crime cases. So I've decided, like many others out there, to go ahead and talk about some true crime cases with you all. If you are also drawn to true crime, and you want to feel better about your own makeup skills, because I have no idea what I'm doing. Seriously, go look at my past videos. No idea what I'm doing. You should absolutely, if you so choose, like, subscribe, and let's hang out together, usually every other Tuesday, where I will take a deep dive look into a true crime case while slapping on the old clown paint. So yeah, how has it been? So sorry for dipping out the first couple months of this new year. I've just had a lot going on. We'll get more into it at the end of the video. For now, just kind of want to start into part one of this case that I wanted to open up with. And today's case, you know, we've said it before, and say it again, right? All murder, of course, right, is senseless. But this one today, oh my God, is especially so. We will be talking about the murder of an entire family. And the perpetrators, like the murderers, you guys, it's gonna blow your mind. This case is very, very trippy. It was a requested case, and it was requested by @HeyHeyYou. So thank you so much for this case suggestion. And I've actually taken a few of your other suggestions, so I'll be shouting you out for a while because you threw some very interesting cases my way. So today we will be talking about the Bellevue Murders, all right? And like I said, this it's a whole family was killed in these, all right? So it's a pretty dark one today. We will be using some foul language, some vulgar language, so, you know, just be prepared for that. And you guys know how much I love cases with books, right? Well, this case also had a book that I used for a lot of my research. So I read the book Deadly Secrets by Putsata Rieng. I hope that's how you pronounce her name. But yeah, this book was written like right after the trial, so it came out in like 2001 or so. And got a lot of information from it and from, you know, newspaper articles and whatnot. And I will also be reading some passages from this book because you know how I love quotes and love getting stuff directly from, right, people's mouths. And there's some interesting tidbits to go over. All right, with all of that preamble, let's just dive right into it, all right? So we're gonna start with, you know, as we normally do, right, our victims, all right? And it was the Wilson family, all right? So let's get into the patriarch of the Wilson family. So William Bill Angus Wilson Jr. was born on November 10th, 1944 in Portland, Oregon. And he would end up meeting his future wife at the University of Washington's Business School, where he attended college. And his future wife's name was Rosalie Rose Ann Mahoney. And the two of them, like I said, would meet at college and they would end up getting married, and both of them would end up becoming accountants. Rose became an accountant for the University of Washington's library, while Bill became an accountant for a construction company called Graham Steel. Now, the couple would have their first child, a daughter who they named Kimberly Ann Wilson, on September 21st, 1976 in Bellevue, Washington. So they're in Bellevue, Washington at this time. And this is where the story does take place. They had another child, another daughter, who they named Julia Jean Wilson, and she was born on July 4th, 1979. Now, in 1984, the couple decided to move to the Bellevue neighborhood of Woodridge. And this was, you know, supposed to be like a nice suburb, nice place to raise, you know, the family, which is what they were looking for. This neighborhood, like I said, was thought to be, you know, very nice, boasted like middle class to upper middle class families. There was like this hill in this neighborhood, right? And the closer one was situated on this hill, like the higher up, the higher your socioeconomic status, all right? So Bill and Rose would end up moving to this neighborhood, like we said, in 1984, and they would start off with a starter home at like the bottom of this hill. And in 1990, after they were able to save enough money, Bill and Rose were able to purchase a little bit nicer, better of a home situated closer up the hill, you know, moving on up, as it were. Now, Bill was described described as having, very strong work ethic, was very, work hard type of guy, prided himself on his work ethic, and he also prided himself on taking care of others and his family. Rose was said to have taken her role as mother as very, very seriously. She was very much involved in her daughter's lives. She would be shuffling them to, like all the events, piano practice, swim meets. She even volunteered as a brownie mom for their Girl Scout troop. Now, it is said overall, the Wilsons had a pretty, average, stable, happy marriage. There were no serious problems or qualms. They were, pretty average, normal family. The Wilsons, as they got older, got closer to their retirement years, which will be at the time, the events of today's case. It is said the Wilsons were still very much active. And this was primarily due to Rose, who was always a very active, athletic type of person. You know what I mean? Always going hiking, biking, swimming. She went to the beach a lot. She went on a lot of walks. She was very, very outdoorsy. And Rose was also an expert scuba diver. Yeah, and she would often go diving into Puget Sound with her scuba group. And for their upcoming 25th anniversary, which was coming up at the time of the events of today's case, the Wilsons were planning on going to Hawaii to celebrate their anniversary, where they were going to go scuba diving and snorkeling and parasailing. And it was going to be a huge, big, fun trip. Now, let's get a little bit into the Wilson daughters, all right, Kimberly and Julia. So, like we alluded to earlier, Kimberly and Julia did swim on the swim team. It was the Norwood swim team. It was one of 2 private swim teams, in the neighborhood. And they were also active members of a youth group at their church, First Presbyterian Church. And in fact, one summer, the girls even traveled with the youth group to Halfway, Oregon, in order to help build homes for the homeless. The girls were also pretty popular babysitters in the neighborhood. Both of them were described as being very responsible and good with children. So they were often called to babysit. They were super popular in the neighborhood. Everyone wanted the Wilson sisters to babysit their kids. Now, even though the 2 sisters, had done plenty together when they were younger, as so happens so often with a lot of siblings, the sisters, as they got older, it became apparent that they were, 2 very different people, 2 very different personalities and temperaments, right? It was said Kimberly was the more rebellious of the 2, as it were. It was said even when she was a toddler, right? Kimberly was one of those babies that, would pull and yank on everything, was one of those kids that you just had to keep an eye on 24/7 because she would find herself in trouble, right? Apparently one time the Wilsons were having their roof done, and the roofers had, left their ladder up to the roof so they could come and go. And Kimberly was only 2 years old, and she somehow climbed, I can't remember if they said halfway or all the way up the ladder. And she was 2. So yeah, Kimberly was always a very mischievous little kid. Kimberly was described as just always having a very innate curiosity about the world around her, about what was around her, So she was just always exploring, always, how kids are just touching and feeling stuff and just really wanting to experience what was around her, right? That was the kind of baby and toddler and person that Kimberly became. It is said, very much like her parents, that Kimberly grew into a very compassionate person, and she was usually sort of like the helper, the mother figure of her social circles. She was that friend that you could always come to with anything. Was a very good listener, always wanted to kind of take care of people. But it is said once Kimberly started experiencing some really bad back issues that would end up being a chronic issue for the rest of her life, Kimberly the book described it as developing an edge. So Kimberly's chronic back pain started when she was still a very young child, all right? And she said that she would feel this tight knot in the lower center of her back, as if someone was sort of stepping or stomping on that part of her back. Can you imagine the pain? Back pain is no joke, all right? Back pain is unbearable. I can't imagine having chronic back pain. Oh my God. And so yeah, as you can imagine, this caused a lot of tremendous pain and uncomfortableness, right? And it said one day, all right, one day, again, she was still a child, don't know the exact age, but one day, right, Kimberly bent over to tie her shoe, as a word, like normal, something you do every day. And all of a sudden, she felt this intense pain shoot through her back, as if someone like snapped her spine or something. And like I stated, this is a pain that would never leave Kimberly at all. Now, a doctor eventually diagnosed her with like a congenital back problem, and they did try everything to alleviate Kimberly's back pain, right? Like including therapy, medications, like they tried everything, even as a last resort, intense rounds of back surgery. Back surgery, guys, oh my god, that is pretty serious and pretty gnarly. But any attempt at curing Kimberly's back pain was halted in 1991 when she was about 15 years old. So they had done this like really intense back surgery where they like were attempting like a bone graft in order to kind of like correct her back problems, but apparently the surgery failed. And so all that pain she went through, all that trauma that included a large, huge disfiguring scar on her back was for nothing. Like it was a failure. And this was just something that she had to deal with. And that was pretty much what the doctors told her, is just like, well, yeah, there's not much we can do. Oh my God. Can you imagine? She was only 15. Now, it is said, of course, what do you think? Like, this was a huge disappointment for Kimberly. Like, this was a huge letdown, a huge disappointment. And to just be told that it's, like, just something you're just gonna have to live with, like, oh my god, dude, can you imagine? Especially, like, you're already a teenager, which is already, like, a shitty time, right? Because you just want to fit in, right? You don't want to stand out in, like, the wrong kind of way. And so, yeah, you just want to be quote-unquote normal, right? Oh, I just can't imagine. And it is said that this chronic back pain is really probably what helped Kimberly develop, like we said earlier, sort of an edge is how it was described. It is said by the time she entered high school, Kimberly had a very, very strong will, right? She definitely took no shit. It was said that she could fight her own battles, including starting them, right? Like she definitely, was not one to back down. And as she entered high school and got older and was sort of like kind of developing her own style, figuring out what she liked and stuff, Kimberly opted for a more what you would call, right, like tomboy look, maybe traditionally more masculine type of look with, baggy shirts, plaid shirts, baggy jeans, backward baseball caps. She also liked more traditionally like masculine activities as well. Like her and her father were restoring a Ford Mustang in their garage together, which I thought that was cool. What a cool bonding activity. Now, Kimberly's younger sister though, Julia, she was like almost the complete opposite of Julia in Kimberly, in many ways. Julia was more shy and reserved compared to the two, right? But Julia wasn't a pushover. Like she had no problem standing up to her big sister if need be, She was just more of like a quiet, reserved kind of person. Now, when Julia had been born, actually, she had been born with like a noticeably droopy left eye, and this required surgery to correct it, and it left her with a metal plate behind like her globe. Now, unlike Kimberly, who really focused on her social life, had like a large variety and group of friends that we'll get into, Julia, like we said, because she was more quiet and reserved, she had kind of like a smaller group of close friends. She also opted for more sort of traditionally feminine teenager activities, like she would much rather go to the mall and hang out with a couple of her friends than like help her dad restore a car in the garage, you know what I mean? And Julia was also sort of the polar opposite of her sister as far as like style and clothing choice and that kind of stuff went. Julia was, much more feminine, wearing, floral prints and dresses and stuff like that. Julia was also, at that age, right, where kids are sort of like just dreadfully embarrassed of their parents that they even exist, right? Julia was not like that. She would hang out with her mom, go to the gym with her mom. Like she was not at all embarrassed to be seen hanging out with her mom. And so for the most part, right, even though they were very, very different, Julia and Kimberly, they got along for the most part, but, there were, of course, some sisterly squabbles, of course, right? Of course there's going to be. So as you can probably surmise from, what we've discussed so far, Kimberly definitely had the more explosive temper of the two, but, like we mentioned earlier, that didn't mean Julia was not afraid to stand up to her big sister. Like, for example, I guess one weekend morning, Rose woke up to just like this loud, like banging and like screaming and fighting. She went downstairs and the girls were fighting. And just as she went downstairs, there was this box of macaroni and cheese that went sailing across the kitchen, and it landed right above Kim's head, like scattering macaroni everywhere. And apparently Kimberly was like giving Julia shit for eating mac and cheese, saying that she would get fat if she ate mac and cheese, and Julia was not having any of it and decided to, launch it at her sister, So there were, like those sibling squabbles that, of course you're gonna have because we're all human. So at the time of the events of today's case, right, or like around the time of the events of today's case, I should say. So like we mentioned earlier, Kimberly was in high school. She attended Bellevue High School. And as her high school career progressed, so too did her back pain. After everything we've discussed, right? Not really a shock or a surprise. And by Kimberly's senior year, she had cut a lot of high school, a lot of class, because she was in chronic back pain, and sitting in those uncomfortable desks. We all know how uncomfortable those are. And then you have chronic back pain on top of that. Yeah, she was just having trouble, concentrating and focusing and studying. So she would cut class a lot of times. And of course, as you can imagine, this caused a lot of conflict between, her and her parents, especially her and her mother, Rose. Kimberly tried telling her mother that, she was just in so much pain. She couldn't concentrate on going to school and focusing on what she needed to focus on because the pain in her back was just so intense. But Rose didn't wholly believe her daughter, right? She thought she was using her chronic back pain as sort of like a crutch, which, yeah, I'll admit, I don't agree with that assessment at all. It's chronic back issues, man. Your back, your back holds you up. You're like, no, yeah, of course she was going to have trouble concentrating and whatnot, But Rose thought maybe Kimberly was just using her back pain as a crutch. So regardless if Kimberly was in pain or not, Rose would make her go to school. And of course, this led to just, more fights between them. Kimberly just kept cutting classes and cutting school. And it was one of those things where it was sort of like a little bit here and there, sort of added up. It was sort of like death by 1,000 cuts, because Kimberly would miss, a day here, a day there. But again, it adds up, right? And it had added up to the point that in her senior year, Kimberly was at risk of failing and not being able to graduate. And so much of her senior year was spent negotiating and pleading with her teachers to try to give her a passing grade, as she explained just how much pain she was in with this back issue. It was a bane on her existence. It was extremely hard to focus and concentrate on, anything, let alone school with, your back in extraordinary pain, right? Now, you're probably wondering, okay, what kind of punishments did Rose and Bill, give Kimberly for, cutting class and, failing and all that? Well, Bill and Rose were not helicopter parents. They didn't really want to give their children too much constraints, Rose had grown up rigidly Catholic, and she wanted the polar opposite experience for her daughters. She wanted them to be able to be independent and be able to operate in the day-to-day world, So Rose and Bill wouldn't do things such as giving their daughters curfews, right? So on top of, Kimberly, cutting class and her mom, thinking that she was just using her chronic issues as a crutch, Rose was also not a huge fan of what she thought were underachieving friends that Kimberly had picked up in her junior and senior years of high school. Now, this was a group of kids, and they were seen as being part of the goth scene because, they dressed in black and listened to, rock and punk and emo music, and, they were all broody and wearing the dark makeup and stuff. Many members of this group were high school dropouts or runaways, and they spent a bulk of their time playing TTRPGs, which, if you do not know, is tabletop role-playing games such as Dungeons & Dragons, D&D. And this group of kids also hung out at the local Denny's diner at night. They were there from like dusk till dawn. And it is said this group also sort of dabbled in sort of like drugs, sex, petty crime like vandalism and theft and stuff. And this was the crowd that Kimberly found herself falling into in her junior and senior years of high school. I mean, quite honestly, it just sounded like your normal group of teenager kids who just happened to sort of be part of the alternative scene. Although, yeah, I'm not on board with the criminal part, like vandalism and theft and stuff. It's like, why do you need to do that? So this was the group of friends that Kimberly found herself in. And as typical things like arguments between her parents about, doing her chores or homework or school attendance escalated, Kimberly retreated further and further into this alternative group of friends. And we mentioned this briefly earlier, right? Kimberly was never short on friends. She was a very outgoing, social kind of person. It said at first she kind of held up a wall a little bit. It was a little difficult to get to know her at first. But as soon as you did, she was very open, like we said, a very caring, very reliable type of friend. So she, had a large group of people that were, considered part of her social circle. Friends from school, friends from church, friends from the neighborhood, and friends from this group that called themselves the Denny's Club. And like she had been with, most of her life, Kimberly was described as sort of, the natural helper of the Denny's Club, We mentioned how a lot of these kids were high school dropouts or runaways. Kimberly would often encourage these kids to go back and get their diplomas, or at least their GED, so they could get, a decent job. Because back in this time, in the 90s, that was actually feasible to get a decent job with just a high school diploma. So it was not unusual for a lot of Kimberly's friends from all of these different groups that we just described to crash on the Wilsons' couch, all right? But a lot of these couch surfers would be from the Denny's Club. And these kids were, like we said, they had either run away, they'd been kicked out, or they were just dropouts, and they needed a place to crash. And it is said the Wilsons had an open door policy, all right? They always would offer their home to anyone who needed it. And it was said Bill and Rose wouldn't even know on any given day, like, who Kimberly was going to bring home. So as time wore on, right, as her senior year is continuing, Kimberly retreats further and further into her group of friends. Her back pain is, as bad as it's ever been. She starts, smoking cigarettes, smoking weed, trying to find something to alleviate her back pain while hanging out with her Denny's Club friends. Additionally, around this time, Kimberly was sort of questioning her sexuality, as a lot of people do around that age especially, right? She was questioning, whether she, might be bisexual, maybe a lesbian, and she did date a couple of girls in high school, though she, was never officially out to, like her family, friends, even her friends in the Denny's Club, It was a very closeted type of thing, which I get, right? Like, it's a very confusing, tough time as it is, but yeah, you lump in those kinds of questions that you experience, right, as you get older, and yeah, it's just a mess. Now, let's go back to the Denny's Club. All right, this alternative group of friends that Kimberly found herself in, and let's talk about a couple of members specifically from this club. So one of the members of this group was actually someone Kimberly had known since like grade school, and she had even like dated him in middle school. It was a little blonde boy named David Anderson. And when they had first met in grade school, Kimberly found out that David had lived right down the street from her and Julia at the time. Now, although David was Julia's age, he and Kimberly grew quite close. And by the time David began middle school, the two were sort of an off-again, on-again couple for 3 consecutive summers. And, I put dating in quotes because, it was sort of like that typical, like, oh, they just hold hands and walk in the park and stuff. But, as Kimberly, was in high school and started becoming more immersed in that, the two kind of like fizzled out. David was a frequent flyer on the Wilsons' couch, often crashing there. And he was considered as part of the family since him and Kimberly had known each other for so long. Now, let's get a little bit more into David here. let's get a little bit into this guy's background. David Carpenter Anderson was born in March, sometime, don't know the exact date, but in March of 1979 in, I believe, Texas. At least that's where his family had come from when they moved to Bellevue, Washington in the early 1980s. His father was Bruce Anderson, and his mother was Leslie Anderson. Now, David had two older brothers named Michael and Troy, and a younger brother named Stephen, so, smack dab middle child. Bruce was a security systems operator who really loved to fire up his barbecue and grill on the weekends. And Leslie was a nursing assistant at the maternity ward in Bellevue Hospital. She was described as a very, shy and endearing woman, always being very calm and serene. Now, the Anderson household was run like a stereotype from the 1950s. In that Bruce called the shots. He believed that all a man had to do was go out and earn a living while women tended to the house and childcare, right? Yeah. And it is from this upbringing that David learned that men call the shots and women are subservient. And this is something David would bring with him into every relationship that he would ever engage with. In a woman. That's what he grew up sort of believing, that, men call the shots and women are subservient to them. It is said when Leslie gave birth to David and then later Stephen, she was a little disappointed because she thought it would be nice to have a little girl to raise. But Leslie still loved her sons a great deal and certainly coddled them a lot. When they were younger, she would of course, shuffle them to baseball practices and stuff like that. And as they got older, when she would come home with groceries, on Saturday afternoons, the boys would just sit there on their ass on the couch watching sports as she brought groceries back and forth, not helping her or anything. If the boys refused to come out of their rooms to eat dinner, she would just bring it to them. Now, as you can imagine, right, not really a big surprise, Bruce was said not to have a whole lot of patience. And he was the stereotypical boomer in that, right, his house, his rules. If you don't like it, you can get out. When Mike and Troy dropped out of high school, remember, that's David's older brothers, Bruce just kicked them out of the home. And the two brothers ended up couch surfing with some friends for a while before they found a home to rent together. Now, when Michael and Troy were thrown out of the home, David grew very, very angry, all right? So I'm not sure if this is supposed to be maybe his first foray into the anger that he will experience the rest of his life or what. But yeah, when his two older brothers were kicked out of the house by his father, David was said to be very angry and upset. His older brothers were his idols, right? That's where he got a lot of his viewpoints and, how you operate in the world, and, he loved them, and he was very angry that his father had driven them away. Arguments began between Bruce and David, and, Leslie, being the feminine stereotype, would always just try to be the peacekeeper and try to stop arguments before they started. So as you can guess, right, this did not go over great. Bruce was very much a stereotypical boomer when it came to raising his sons, right? He wanted them to be manly men who respected authority and were obedient. And he was not above physical abuse to get that point across, right? So if the boys, did something wrong, came home with bad grades or something, Bruce was not above, beating them. David's childhood friend Alex, who we will get into in a moment, recalled several times where David would come to school with, bruises and marks on his arms and hands. And he said, quote, "They looked like knuckle marks," is what he would say, is what Alex said about the injuries, rather. And as you can guess, right, the more tight of a control Bruce tried to have on all of his sons, but, David in this instance, right, the more control he lost, right, the more they slipped through his fingers. And, the more he physically abused them, right, the more he tried to control them, the more they rebelled. It is said that Troy was kind of the biggest rebel of all the brothers. I guess one time in 1991, a neighbor had called the police on Troy and a friend who were throwing knives in the air and seeing where they were gonna land. And I don't know if this lady was walking by, they were throwing them at her or what, but she called the police because she was scared that one of the knives was going to hit her. And apparently this neighbor also reported seeing Troy throw some firecrackers in a grill and pour lighter fluid on it and light it on fire. So yeah, definitely not all is well in the Anderson household, right? Now it is said after Troy and Michael moved out, Whenever Bruce did try to raise a hand to them, the boys would fight back. And as soon as that happened, as is, I think it's pretty, is it fairly uncommon or common with abusers that when their victim raises a hand to them, they stop. That's what happened here is, he realized he could not bully his sons anymore. They were younger and stronger. He was older. And so he stopped physically abusing them. So Troy and Michael, right, get out on their own, fairly young. They end up running with a pretty rough crowd and kind of get their own rap sheet, right? And David, of course, idolizes his big brothers. So what do you think he does? He ends up becoming sort of like a little shit himself. Now, David was described as being very popular, not just within the Denny's Club, but just kind of popular in general, especially with the girls, all right? And he was certainly the most popular and sought-after member of this alternative scene that Kimberly found herself in. And it's because David, really prided himself on his looks, and, he was like 5'7", had like blonde hair, had a very like muscular physique, had a very like baseball figure is how it was described. And on the outside, he had this like extremely calm and cool, mysterious demeanor about him, right? So of course teenage girls ate that up. But in actuality, on the inside, David was fuming. He had a lot of anger, primarily directed at his father, but as he got older, it just kind of became like anger in general. You know what I mean? And the older he got, the more violent he got. He would often beat up kids. He was a bully. And he would do this all while under this like mask of coolness, all right? He almost sounded like a stereotype from a teen movie. David ended up having a string of girlfriends who all acted more like his mother than actual someone he dated. They would cook for him, wash his clothes, give him money, sex, and were just completely wrapped around his finger. It was said David was very conscious about who he decided to date. He picked out specific girls that were, you can guess, right, were easily manipulated, maybe had some self-esteem issues, right? Like, he was very conscious about the type of girl he dated. And of course, since we're dealing with teenagers, teen girls. And because David was like this cool, sexy, mysterious goth, right? The girls just ate it up, man. And he would just have a string of girls just at his beck and call. And that was sort of, right, like the typical thing, like, after all, he could have any girl. And he chose them, so they're very special, like, oh my gosh, yeah. And, like, you can't tell these girls, like, girl, come on, like, he's obviously a pig. Because would you listen when you were a teenager? Of course not. David also had a really, really vast interest in fantasy, often reading like fantasy books and stuff. He also liked to read a lot about criminals. It was said he sort of like admired them, for like bucking authority and just doing whatever they wanted, which, right, given his background, kind of makes sense why, of course, he would have this sort of viewpoint. It was said he was very fascinated with the crimes that caused these prisoners to get locked up. He was very fascinated with this idea that, like, all your freedom can get taken away. And he was determined that he would never allow anyone to tell him how to run his life or what to do. And, right, I mean, shock, with this attitude and stuff, the more he started really resenting his parents, primarily his father's, rigid control that they were trying to heave on him, right? By the time David entered middle school, he had hit the weights very, very hard, much like his older brother Michael, and he had developed a very, very lean, muscular physique. And yeah, David lived his life as he preached, all right? He never let anyone tell him what to do. He talked back to his parents, to his teachers, to anybody and everybody, didn't do his homework, didn't do his chores, and just did whatever he wanted. Would often skip school, pick fights, and would often run away from home, sleeping in abandoned cars, or crashing on friends' couches, such as the Wilsons. Or he would go see his good friend Alex. And now let's get a little bit more into Alex. He was another member of the Denny's Club, and he was considered David Anderson's very close friend. So Alex Kevin Baranyi Jr. was born on May 14th, 1979 in Cleveland, Ohio. His parents were Alex Baranyi Sr. and Patricia Stephen. Now, Alex Sr. had taken classes at Dale Carnegie, where he studied to be a salesman, specifically a computer salesman. And once he had finished that, he moved back to his native Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And this is where his abusive PTSD father lived and his brother Larry lived. So he moved back home. And in 1970, he would meet Patricia, who was barely in her 20s. And when the two met, both of them were very, very eager to get out on their own and leave their respective homes. Patricia lived with her mother Ellen and two brothers. And when Patricia was 9 years old, her father up and abandoned the family out of nowhere. And it is said this really traumatized Patricia and left her with like lifelong trauma. So like we said, right, when the two first met, they were eager to really leave their respective homes. Alex Sr., of course, wanted to leave his abusive father. Patricia just wanted to leave her home because her mother was very overbearing, all right, especially after their father abandoned them. She would always tell Patricia what pigs men were, always tell her like, oh, you need to stop smoking, you need to stop slouching, and was just like always on her ass, right? Didn't let her do anything, didn't let her date or anything. So when Alex Sr. and Patricia meet, right, both of them were very desperate to get out on their own. And so to that end, the two rushed into marriage. Alex Sr. got a job as a computer software salesman, and this job required him to travel quite a lot. So he would often be gone on business trips, leaving Patricia to tend to the house. In 1979, the couple relocated to Cleveland, Ohio. It is said they wanted to be away from their families while still being like close enough, like they didn't want to go, halfway across the country away from them, but they wanted to be like away from them. But as more time had gone on, right, by this time, 1979, the couple had bickered a lot, right? They were bickering and fighting. Big shock, right? Rushing into a marriage with someone you hardly know. And they would just bicker and argue over little things, right? And because this is, the 1970s, they thought, oh, what would help our problems? What would help our marriage, which is just like crumbling and stuff? Let's have a kid. Let's bring a child into the shit show, right? What a great idea. Now, the problem here, right? The problem is that neither Alex Sr. or Patricia ever really wanted kids, right? Patricia didn't think that she could handle the responsibility of being a mother, and Alex Sr. had never really cared to have kids at all. But, at this point, the couple were at an impasse. And so, they thought just plowing along and bringing a kid into their shit show of a marriage was a great idea. And that's what they did. And in that same year, 1979, Patricia gave birth to Alex Jr. Now, Alex was described as never being an outgoing or social baby or toddler or even child. The neighborhood the Baranyis lived in, mostly had retirees, all right? So Alex didn't even have neighborhood children to play with when he was really young or anything. And he didn't really have children to socialize with either, right? At 3 years old, Alex would find a best friend in the neighbor's dog called Smokey. And while his father was out on business trips and Patricia was just glued to the television, Alex would be left to his own devices. He would often, play outside riding his tricycle alone, playing with the dog Smokey. He'd go swing alone on the playset in the backyard. And, it was said isolation, and loneliness and just solitude was with Alex pretty much from the beginning of his life. Quote, "I remember sitting on top of the slide. I had a profound feeling of loneliness. I never had any kid friends." And this is what Alex would later say about his childhood. Now, because Alex spent so much time alone and in solitude, he adapted to reading quite quickly, learning to read at 3 years old. He particularly loved nature books and later developed an interest for sci-fi and fantasy. Alex said that he never really remembered his father much in his formative years because he would always be gone, but that he would always return home with a briefcase and a stuffed animal underneath his arm. Whenever Alex Sr. went out on business trips, he always returned with a stuffed animal for Alex. So his whole room had a whole line of stuffed animals. However, surprise, surprise, having a kid did not magically make the Baranyis' problems go away, right? As you can guess, big shock, right? Alex Sr. had the sort of quote-unquote traditional view of marriage, where all the man had to do was go out and make a living, and the women tend to the child rearing and the house cleaning. And Patricia was growing really resentful of all the responsibility heaped onto her shoulders. You know, she felt like she was pulling her weight more than he was. And they would often, you know, argue about this, like who was pulling more weight and who should do what, and it was just not a good time. They would often yell at each other. I don't think there was any physical abuse, just a lot of like verbal and emotional abuse. Alex Sr. then decided to move the family to Washington State. By that point in time, he was more interested in like computer themselves than selling them or selling software for them. And there was, you know, the big tech boom happening over in Washington at that time. And so he thought now was a good time to pivot over to that. And so he moved his family to Washington. And, you know, the thought process was also, right, like, oh, fresh start will help with our problems, right? So when Alex was 3 years old in 1982, the Baranyis moved to Everett, Washington, which was a suburb north of Seattle. And once there, Alex Sr. started up his own computer consulting business. And Patricia got a job as a teacher's assistant at the Lake Stevens School District. However, I know you guys are going to be totally shocked Pikachu face when I tell you that this move, this fresh start, did not solve the problems. And the fighting just escalated, the marriage deteriorated more, and by 1987, the two would often fight, verbally abusing each other, lobbing insults at each other, and whenever his parents fought, Alex would retreat to his bedroom, bury himself in his stuffed animals, and suck his thumb, a habit which he wouldn't break until he was 15 years old. He developed that as a coping mechanism, and he would just sit there and wonder why his family couldn't be normal, why his parents didn't like each other, and like why they had to fight all the time, which is just super, super sad. And then on July 1st, 1987, Patricia packed a bag and straight up abandoned her family. She said she was tired of the verbal abuse that she was suffering from her husband, and she thought her son would be better served staying with his father since he was the one with a stable career and income. Now, Alex Sr., of course, was extremely upset. Not just that his wife left him, he was upset that she had left him with the kid. And so Alex Sr. suddenly found himself being a single father, you know, feeding his son McDonald's or rice, the only thing he could cook. And, you know, because, I mean, you can already guess the kind of guy that Alex Sr. is, right? He was not a father. Like, he expected Alex, this young kid who's like, you know, like not even 10 years old, to set his own alarm, cook his own breakfast, get to school, dress himself, and all that. Like, Alex was left to his own devices. Now, not long after Patricia left, Alex Sr. was before a judge petitioning for a divorce. And as, you know, you can probably guess, it was a long, nasty, drawn-out affair. And it was mainly drawn out and nasty because neither parent wanted to fully relinquish their rights to their son, albeit for different reasons, right? Alex Sr., it is said, just wanted to spite Patricia. That is all that motivated him to fight for custody of his son. And he was adamant about keeping Alex away from her. In fact, he would actually refer to Alex by his middle name, Kevin. He would call him Kevin because he didn't want his name associated with a hell spawn that came from a hell bitch like Patricia. Yeah. Can you imagine? Like, yeah, that's mature. I don't understand. I mean, this is why you shouldn't have kids unless you actually want them. Poor Alex was used as a pawn in the divorce, often cited in court documents, often being pitted in the middle. And as we will get into, he was constantly shuffled around between Pennsylvania and Washington. He moved 5 times in as many years, which, as you can guess, right, as a developing child is totally not gonna fuck with his development at all. Now, it is said amid the divorce, Alex became very broody, very sulky. His temperament alternated between explosive outbursts and long, intense bouts of silence. He was very, very shy, often sitting by himself, watching the other kids play at recess. He had no friends. He was very socially awkward, as you can guess. Like, look at his early formative years, what he was exposed to. So yeah, he was socially awkward. And it is said all Alex wanted more than anything in the world was just a friend. He just wanted one friend. That's all he wanted. It is said Alex felt the most alone at home, where his father just, really neglected him. His father was determined to move on and forget Patricia and was focused on finding a new bangmaid. So in the summer of 1988, a year after Patricia had left him, Alex Sr. moved back to the East Coast to woo an old high school sweetheart. Her name was Mary Beth Olick, but Alex Sr., he was worried that his son might, muck this opportunity up. So he then told Alex, well, you know what? Go live with your mother, because I don't want you to, fuck up this potential new, opportunity I have. So Alex Sr. pawned his son off on Patricia and then flew off to the East Coast. That fall, Alex enrolled in the 4th grade at Pilchuck Elementary School, and this was in Lake Stevens, Washington, where Patricia rented an apartment. And remember, she also worked for the school, the Lake Stevens School District. In grade school, Alex, of course, because he was quiet and socially awkward, was a popular target for bullies. In fact, on his very first day at school, he was accosted by 3 older boys, and Alex was able to defend himself and kick one of them in the ribs. And after that, he took off running. And he spent all day, hiding behind bushes, hiding behind trees, hiding behind corners, worried that the bullies were following him. And he did not even make it to school that day. Now, within months of Alex Sr. dropping Alex off with Patricia, he calls up Patricia and was like, yo, you know what? This thing is going pretty well with Mary Beth. Why don't you go ahead and send the kid over? Because I want to see if this is going to work out. Of course, not caring at all about the instability in his young son's life. Of course. You think that ever entered his thick skull? Of course not. And so reluctantly, Patricia did as he wanted. Now, it is said Patricia was just trying to play nice with Alex Sr. She, was really scared that he was gonna take Alex away more so than he already had, because he was the one that had, more money, and so was able to, hire better lawyers and stuff. So she was like, all right, I really don't want to, but I'll send him off to you. So once in Pennsylvania, Alex was enrolled in Trafford Elementary School, and at this point in time, it was halfway into the school year. And so poor Alex had to again be the new kid. But get this, guys. By that same summer, Alex Sr. had sent Alex back to Lake Stevens in Washington to live with Patricia. And that is because he was planning on marrying Mary Beth, and they were going to move to Washington anyway, so they decided to just move Alex out to Washington up ahead of them. It's just so awful, the instability that this a-hole has instilled in his son's life is just unbelievable. And it said Alex Sr. was so wrapped up in his new bangmaid that he neglected Alex even more so than before, not buying him new school clothes or school supplies or anything like that, completely neglected him. But it's okay, because in typical shit parent fashion, Alex Sr. thought he could make up for his shit parenting by bribing his son and buying him a Nintendo. And the Nintendo would end up being a large part of escapism for Alex. He ended up collecting a large amount of games and would spend hours on end just playing. Now, when Alex Sr. decided to, lift his head up from the sand and realize he had a son, he noticed that, oh wow, yeah, my son is sort of antisocial. He doesn't have any friends. And so he took him to a therapist at the Lutheran Counseling Network. And there he told the therapist that he thought his son was depressed. Gee, I wonder why. And that he seemed both uninterested and unable to make friends. Completely neglecting the fact that it was the instability that his parents, primarily instigated by his father, was subjecting him to is what was causing him to not be able to make friends. Alex wanted friends, but, he had no social skills when he was very young, and bouncing around from school to school in those formative years, why would he even bother trying to make friendships if he knew he was just going to be shipped off anyway, Patricia also noticed her son's antisocial behavior, and shortly after Alex entered the fifth grade, again at Pilchuck Elementary School, and this was in 1989, she asked the school psychologist to speak to her son. But before the psychologist had the opportunity to do so, Alex Sr. had yanked Alex out of that school and had re-enrolled him in another school in Washington. Now, it is said with every move that he had to endure, all right, Alex grew more and more angry and resentful. Particularly angry and resentful at his father, whom he really blamed largely for the instability in his life. He had already felt neglected by his father, but he felt even more neglected after he had remarried. And it said Alex actually enjoyed living with his mother. And he began realizing that it was primarily his father who was causing all this instability in his life. And yeah, he grew to resent him and be really, really angry and hateful towards him. And as Alex got older and started resenting his father more and more, he became even more withdrawn. He also became very cynical and despondent about the world around him. It got to the point where when he would come home from school, he would just grab some food from the fridge, head down to the basement where his bedroom was, where his computer, Nintendo's TV, and books awaited him, and he would just stay in there and not converse with anybody, not come out, or anything. He just drowned in all of his darkness and hatred. He even wrote a lot of his musings and his thoughts in journals and diaries and stuff, which we will get into later. Now, Alex was actually quite intelligent. He was, he wasn't stupid. His IQ was tested when he was almost 18, and he was only 3 points shy of being labeled a genius. He was terrible at math and hated it, but he excelled at English and art classes. Although, because he didn't apply himself even to classes he liked, Alex would usually get D's and F's in school. And of course, this didn't go unnoticed by Alex Sr., who instead of, encouraging your son, figuring out why he's failing in school, instead berated him. Told him he was a crappy kid, why couldn't he be a better son, and why was he so stupid, and on and on and on. Yeah. Real great parenting there. In 1991, Alex started 7th grade at Chinook Middle School. Yet another new school, that he was dreading, where he'd be the new kid. He'd be bullied, he wouldn't have any friends, and he hated it. David also started 7th grade at Chinook Middle School this same year and day. And as it just so happens, David was looking for a target to pick on this day. Now, it is said before this first day of school, neither Alex nor David had interacted with each other, despite living only like 2 blocks away from each other at that time. I don't know how long they lived that close to each other. So that first day of school, Alex and David would have their very first interaction when Alex was playing wall ball by himself in gym class. David noticed the loner new kid and, sauntered up to him and was like, oh, hey, yeah, can I play, because David was a very smooth operator, very charismatic. And so Alex, it said at first, was kind of wary. He was like, wait, why is this, jock-looking dude who everyone seems to, be all about, why does he want to come hang out with me, whatever. But he decided, fine, all right, I'll let him, play around with me, whatever. And so David grabbed the ball, and then he chucked it at the wall really hard and angled it so that it would slam into Alex, which it did, right into his chest. And Alex was immediately annoyed at himself mainly for allowing himself to be duped into being bullied yet again. And, David, it said, saw how, upset and annoyed Alex looked, and he grabbed the ball and, gave it to him. Was like, oh, hey, man, I was just kidding. I was just kidding, man. So, Alex took the ball and just kind of nodded, yeah, okay, whatever. And that was the very first interaction that David Anderson and Alex Baranyi had. It is said from that day onward, whenever David would see Alex in the halls at school, he would shout stuff, to him like, oh, hey, dork, where you going? Hey, geek. And whenever Alex would see David in the halls, he would turn around and try to go the opposite direction. Other times, David would come up behind Alex and, push him and stuff. If they got off on the same bus stop together, David would follow Alex, berate him, chuck pine cones at him. Now, the book states that David was sort of pushing buttons on purpose, wanting to see how much this wimpy kid was going to take. Was he going to take it, or was he going to stand up for himself? And Alex just kept taking it. And the book states this is exactly what David was looking for. Someone who wouldn't stand up to themselves and could, be easily controlled and manipulated. And the book also states that at this same time, all right, in this weird way, Alex almost liked the attention he was getting from David, he didn't have any friends. No one ever paid him any attention at all. And this popular jock kid chose to pick on him. So in a weird way, He kind of liked the attention. And that is how the strange friendship between these two started, was David bullying Alex and Alex just taking it. Quote, "The more he beat up on me, the more we had a chance to talk." And this was according to Alex. And after about a year or two, the boys were joined at the hip. They were always seen together. They would always be taking, long walks in the park, hanging out and playing video games together, playing tabletop games together. They bonded over their love of fantasy, would even fashion, make-believe swords out of PVC pipe and duct tape, and sometimes even pretend fighting with real swords. They joust with each other, in front of David's house, or go out in the park. They started taking up fantasy LARPing, which, if you don't know what LARPing is, it's live action role play where you become a character and, act out a little scenario. And David and Alex would start LARPing when they were in the 8th grade. David would often choose to play some sort of gnome, thief, or mercenary character, while Alex always favored a more dark approach to his characters. Sometimes he would be set Typhon Tennis, the Greek god of night, darkness, storms, and catastrophe. But most of the time, Alex would play a character he created who he called Slicer Thunderclap. He was a half-cyborg mercenary who was cold, unfeeling, and possessed traits of thievery and being able to move among the shadows. His character was in love with a strong mythical woman who he called Rose, and Alex described her as a beautiful, compassionate, strong, and loyal woman. Now, classmates described the two boys as a little odd, and they were seen as sort of like the typical weirdos because, they sported that sort of stereotypical goth look, and, they had ponytails, indulged in, quote-unquote nerdy things like tabletop games and stuff, even joining a gaming club. But that doesn't seem to be the primary reason why the two were sort of side-eyed just a little bit. Because remember, David was still pretty popular, They were seen as weird, maybe even a little creepy, because of how far they took the tabletops and the role-playing. Particularly Alex. An ex-classmate of theirs, named John Rouse, said, quote, "They lived in their own fantasy world. They wanted to be in there permanently." Another ex-classmate, named Stu Swofford, expanded on that, saying that both boys, but especially Alex, just took the role-playing too far. Quote, "He would try to pick fights sometimes. The line between fantasy and reality was a bit too thin. He would act out his character too much. If his character got offended, he might try to take a swing at someone." Even David and Alex's friends in the Denny's Club noticed just how into role-playing the two boys were, and just how serious, they would take it. They would go to the Woodridge Water Tower Park, where they would, that's where they would LARP and joust with each other, and sometimes, they would go full-on LARP, donning themselves in makeup and capes and their fake swords and stuff. In 1996, Alex was actually banned from a TTRPG group that called themselves the Dark Ballad Gaming Society, and it was after violating the group's rules. Quote, "When Baranyi was asked to leave, he wasn't doing anything bad or sinister or anything like that. He was just being immature. We have a rule that you can't touch someone if they don't want you to. I believe that was the reason." And this was according to Tim Clancy, who ran the gaming society. Both David and Alex were kicked from another gaming group called Camarilla for the exact same behavior. In fact, Alex was known in the Denny's Club, who were equally into tabletops and role-playing and all that, as the one who would never come out of character even when they were done playing. They said he would stay in his Slicer Thunderclap persona for hours on end. And remember when we said that Alex would often journal his thoughts and his musings and all that was going on inside? Well, he would also write in his journal as Slicer Thunderclap. And I'm going to read to you from the book a little passage from Alex's journal that he wrote, again, as Slicer Thunderclap. Quote, "All things deserve life, and as such, many things deserve death. Those that sing praise of killing have never done it. Killing is very hard. It pushes our minds to the limit. It crashes our egos against the jagged shores of our conscience. Ask yourself, do those in my family deserve to be wiped from existence? It's a hard choice if you think about it for a while. I have done the unspeakable. Death and killing neither worries or scares me. I have seen and done far worse. Death is supreme. There is nothing beyond death. Within our hands we hold the flame of life. I have done the unspeakable. I have become a god, for I keep my lips close to others' flames, ready to blow the wind of judgment. Through my power, I am God. There are those higher than me, but their power is no greater. Fear not death, respect it. ST, and that was signing it off as Slicer Thunderclap. So yeah, you could say he took it pretty seriously, right? And, you know, like the book was saying, it's really no wonder that Alex would, of course, prefer to be in this fantasy world, right? Where he was, you know, a hero who, you know, rescued people and had like the damsel and all that stuff, right? It's really no wonder because, you know, it is said in the real world, Alex was very well aware of his place in the world. And, you know, it really, you know, weighed on him in his mind. Quote, "My entire life has been one insult after another. Eventually, my ego and self-consciousness were torn down until only emptiness filled me. You see, in emotional terms, the feelings of pain and anger come quickest and last longest. So when I became empty, I filled that space with pain, anger, hatred, and evil." And that was something Alex wrote in his journal as himself. Now, the boys also partook in more dark and sinister activities, such as, you know, mutilating bugs and harassing cats and stuff. Yeah, never good when you're picking on animals. They would pick the wings off of a fly just to see it struggle. They would tease girls that they saw walk around the neighborhood. They would steal cigarettes, either from David's brothers or from the store. Now, according to the newspapers, Alex had some, like, minor brushes with the law in 1992. There was an incident where he was issued a violation in Everett for an unregistered boat, and in September of that same year, he was cited in Issaquah for not wearing a seatbelt. But I'm wondering if that wasn't his father, since they're a junior and a senior. But yeah, that was what the newspapers had reported on. But Alex did start doing some, you know, pretty, you know, not great stuff, taking David's lead, such as stealing. Apparently, Alex even had a list in his notebook of things that a shoplifter should and shouldn't do, and like how to get away with it, and was just very detailed and extensive. David and Alex were known around the neighborhood as the Blues Brothers because they were always walking around, you know, dressed just in dark and looking all broody. But it was said it's really their personalities that differentiated them. Now, David, obviously, based on everything we've described about him, was definitely the more outgoing and charismatic of the two. He had a strong, confident, like, walk, right? Always had, you know, very rigid posture because he had a lot of self-confidence and really took pride in his looks, right? Everything about him just, like, exuded, you know, like testosterone manliness, you know. Alex, meanwhile, right, was almost the antithesis of that. He was very quiet, temperamental. The slightest perceived insult could cause him to explode, and explode in very, like, violent ways. In March of 1996, Alex actually attacked a 16-year-old girl. Her name was Dawn Kinchy, and he hit her in the head, kicked her in the stomach, and told her that he was going to kill her. And, you know, it is said that Dawn and her mother reported the incident to police, but, like, nothing ever happened to Alex. So yeah, he definitely was getting more violent and angry the older he got, and the more into role-playing that he got. Though he was the same weight as David, Alex was a bit taller than him, more wiry, and, you know, whereas David walked with very, you know, cocksure, confident posture, Alex usually, you know, walked in sort of like, you know, huddled in on himself, slouching a lot. Alex was also the polar opposite of David when it came to self-care and grooming. Whereas David, as we know, took care of himself, prided himself on his looks, so he always looked, clean, took care of, like any facial hair in his hair and stuff like that. But Alex didn't really care, often wearing the same clothes for days on end, not bathing a whole lot, and just having a very, general menacing air about him. But one person who was not really fond of David was Alex's father. He thought David was lazy, cocky, and manipulative. And simply put, he thought David spelled trouble for his son. But there was little to nothing he could do to prevent the two boys from seeing each other. Alex Sr. knew that Alex was sneaking out at night to go hang out with David, and so he had installed a security system just to catch him in the act, and whenever he did, he would drag Alex back home. He even superglued his window shut because when when Alex would see a silhouette in his window, a flicker of light and then a tapping, he knew David would be waiting for him at the stop sign down the street. That was like their signal. And every time Alex's father would drag him back home, say that he wasn't allowed to see David, but the two, always found a way to hang out with each other. The boys would often hung out at Sunvilla Lanes, which was the bowling alley, and it's where, the teens hung out. That was like the local spot. David had spent a lot of time there because his brother Troy had worked there at one point in time. David would go there, to scope out the girls, and when he found one that he would like, he would swoop in and charm them, and they would be just put study in his hands. He was just the type of guy who knew how to talk to girls, was very funny and charming, and yeah, dude, teen girls just ate it up. Ate it up. You know, not only did he have like the mysterious, dark, cool goth thing going for him, right? He was also good looking and had like a hot body, and, you know, couple that with like the charm and charisma and stuff. Like, yeah, get out of here. He cleaned up. Alex, on the other hand, would often be left by himself to hang out in the shadows all awkwardly as David went and scored on chicks. When David would see a girl that he would like, he would tell Alex just to kind of like stay there while he went and did his thing. Like Alex was like a puppy or something to be left behind. And it is said when Alex did find the courage to talk to a girl, he was very awkward. He stumbled, mumbled a lot, and just got very tongue-tied and was just very awkward. But there were actually some girls in the Denny's club who would later come out and say that they thought Alex was, you know, kind of cute. He was like polite and quiet, and they actually kind of liked this sort of like sexy, mysterious, like greasy goth look. Like there were actually a few girls who thought he was a cutie. However, even if a girl did show interest in Alex, what do you think David did? Yep, you guessed it. He would swoop in and start openly flirting with them. You know, he'd be like, oh, hey, Alex, why didn't you tell me, you know, you were talking to this cutie over here? And, you know, stuff like that. And before Alex knew it, the girl's attention was completely on David, and they were off in the corner making out. And Alex was left there to feel and look like a heel. Now, it is said every time this happened, Alex would get angry and upset, but like the story of his life, right? He just learned to take it. And, you know, Alex just accepted a lot of things, like David barking orders at him and acting like his errand boy. David would take over conversations, order for Alex at Denny's, bark orders at him to go get him a cigarette. And of course, all the chicks with David just thought it was so cool that he had his own servant who was like at his beck and call. But David, as we can all sense, right, was a major asshole and an asshole to girls. And once he got his hooks into a girl, he would treat them very poorly. He would call them bitches and whores and sluts behind their backs, say they were only good for sex. Quote, Dave is such a womanizer. He stole girls from everyone. He stole girls from me. And this is what Alex said. However, in late 1994, Alex met a girl for whom he would do anything for. Her name was Sarah Lamp. And her and Alex actually went on 2 dates in November of that year, but unfortunately, Sarah called it off, apologizing to Alex, saying that she was going to go back to her on-again, off-again boyfriend. So that's David and Alex, all right? That was David and Alex, part of the scene that Kimberly found herself in the Denny's Club. So let's pivot back to Kimberly, all right? So it's midwinter, 1995. Kimberly was having more arguments and fights with her parents, mostly about what they saw as a lack of drive in her life. She didn't really want to go to college, and that caused like a big kerfuffle. And yeah, they just thought that she was kind of like wasting her life and had no direction. They had actually given her an ultimatum for after she graduated high school, either go to college, get a job, or move out. Kimberly was spending more and more time with the Denny's Club at this point, dabbling in things that could help alleviate her back pain. And at this point, she was just trying to figure out her life, you know? And I do think it's so funny in our society that we expect, like at 18 years old, for kids to like plan out their life. Like, that's bananas. That's like, think of how stupid you are at 18 and you're supposed to figure out your life at that point. Like, come on. So Kimberly did end up graduating high school in 1995. But like we said, she was not really motivated to go to college. So instead, she got an administration job at Costco. And then she took night classes at Bellevue Community College. She, didn't really know what she wanted to do with her life. She didn't really have a sense of urgency to figure it out either, because she figured, I'm young. I can figure this stuff out. I'm just going to kind of try to find my own way, And so, she thought she could just take each day as it came, and in the meantime, community college was like a good stopgap in between. Maybe get her parents off her back, and then she could also maybe like dip her toe in like maybe some different things and find out what she wanted to do. She would usually grab her books and then head to Denny's and study there until her friends came, and then she'd hang out with them. And it was around this time specifically, like senior year of high school graduation, where Kimberly really started seriously questioning her sexuality, wondering if she was bisexual or maybe lesbian. She was definitely looking at girls in that way, but she hadn't mentioned it to anyone, even her friends in the Denny's Club. And she would make a point to befriend any of the new girls who joined the group. And in January of 1995, Kimberly would end up meeting and befriending one of these girls. So in January 1995, Kimberly ran into an old friend. It was Mike Anderson, David's older brother. And she ran into him at the Quality Food Center grocery store. It was located in the neighboring city of Factoria. And Mike was a year ahead of Kimberly, and so they knew each other. And so he stopped and said hi to her. And, you know, Michael was like, hey, do you want to come with me? I'm going to go see my on-again, off-again girlfriend. Her name is Sarah Lamp. Do you want to come? And so she did. So that night, Sarah, Michael, and Kimberly all went to the Denny's. And throughout the course of the evening, Kimberly and Sarah figured out that they actually had a lot in common, and they really started kind of jiving, you know, really vibing and sparking with each other. They ended up talking the whole evening. Shortly after that evening, Kimberly called up Sarah to see if she wanted to get some coffee, and she did. And then, a short time after that, when Sarah and Michael finally broke up, Kimberly asked Sarah out for coffee. And it is after this coffee meetup that Kimberly began chronicling her feelings for Sarah in her diary. She talked about their dates together, how they got along, and even how they kissed a couple of times. So they kind of became sort of an item after that coffee date. According to the diary, the two became an item, but they weren't out to anyone, not even their friends in the Denny's Club. However, it should be noted, in the book, which was published in like 2001, Sarah vehemently denies any type of sexual relationship or any type of intimate relationship with Kimberly. I don't know what she says now, but I just thought I should point that out. So in early 1995, right, when Kimberly and Sarah are in the middle of like their relationship, according to Kimberly's diary, things were going pretty good for her. She had a pretty good job. She was going to school, getting her parents off her back. She had good friends, and she was falling in love with Sarah. However, unbeknownst to Kimberly, she had made an enemy in Alex. He had heard through the Denny's grapevine that Kimberly and Sarah were kind of like a thing. Because I think it's one of those things, right, where like you think you're being all like sly and, you know, like top secret and no one's gonna know we're together, but it's kind of one of those things where people are like, yeah, no, like we totally know that you're together. That's sort of like the vibe I got within the Denny's Club, that like, you know, though Sarah and Kimberly weren't like officially out as a couple or anything, a lot of people were like, yeah, I'm pretty sure they're like an item, right? A thing. And so Alex heard this through the Denny's Club grapevine, and he was very, very unhappy. Remember, Sarah is the one that he really fell for. And when he heard this, dude, it just made him seethe with anger and jealousy. So every time Alex and David would see Kimberly and Sarah at Denny's, which was quite often, Alex would just like quietly brood and just have so much anger and hate towards Kimberly. Now, Kimberly had been aware of Alex. You know, she also attended middle school with David and Alex, so she was aware of him. But she always thought Alex was like a little weird, a little broody and weird, and just kind of off-putting. So she never like really spent time with him, and he wasn't someone that she would elect to spend time with. And the only times that they would hang out together would be, you know, in the Denny's Club. Kimberly and Sarah continued their relationship for a couple of months before Sarah broke it off with Kimberly, saying that she was going to go back to Mike. Kimberly chronicled in her diary that she was sad to see the relationship end, but she really wanted to be friends with Sarah, and so she went out of her way to be friends with her. Alex, meanwhile, was growing more obsessed with Sarah. Once he heard that she was back with Mike, he somehow realized that he had like more competition than he thought, maybe because like Sarah was possibly bisexual. And during the summer of 1995, Alex called and paged Sarah like several times within a short amount of time, but she would never return any of his calls or pages. And finally, in August of that year, he sent off a second letter to her when his first one went unanswered. And I'm just gonna read it to you because it is certainly something. So this is the letter that Alex wrote to Sarah. Quote, "Dear Sarah, have you noticed that just about every damn song on the radio has to do with a guy being really happy with a woman, a guy being real sad because he doesn't have a woman, or it's a guy wishing he had a woman in his life? I sat and listened to the radio for a couple of hours, and I've never been so depressed in my entire life. Sorry, I don't like not being able to talk to you. You're the only woman I've ever really felt comfortable talking to. This being grounded really sucks. No phone, TV, or friends. I think I'm going to have to kill my parents very soon. At least they let me listen to the radio. Big whoop there. I'm so depressed and emotionally empty that suicide seems like a nice thing to do. Death sounds pretty relaxing, but then I wouldn't be able to see you. I'm starting to think that there really is something fundamentally wrong with everything in general. Nothing really fits in place. Life itself is like reading every other page in a novel. You get the general idea, but it never totally makes sense. And all in all, it's not very interesting. Signed, Slicer Thunderclap. Yeah. Sarah, of course, was very put off by this, you know. She thought it was very bizarre. She thought it was really weird that Alex signed the letter in his character persona. And she was worried that he might hurt himself, so she did show the letter to her mother. And her mother, you know, although she thought it was very worrying, ultimately the two decided, you know what, Alex is just trying to get some sort of reaction from Sarah. He wants to be in contact with you. So this is just his way of like crying out for attention. So we're not going to do anything. And so Sarah and her mother didn't tell anyone or reach out to anyone or anything like that. Meanwhile, Alex just pined for Sarah more and more. So one time during the summer, as usual, Alex was crashing at David's house, all right, staying in David's room, of course. And, you know, he sat there at night, right, when everyone was asleep, and he just couldn't get over the fact that, you know, his best friend's brother had, like, the girl of his dreams. And he pondered this over and over. Now, in the middle of the night, David awoke, and he saw that Alex's sleeping bag was empty. So he was like, oh, is he, like, in the bathroom or something? So he, you know, steps out into the hall, doesn't see the bathroom light on, and decides to peek into his brother's room. Mike was in the bedroom. I can't remember if he was in bed with Sarah or not, sleeping. I can't remember. But when David peeks into Mike's room, he was startled to see Alex standing over his sleeping brother with a knife. David, of course, is like, dude, like, what are you doing? What are you doing? And Alex just smiled and lowered the knife and said he just wanted to scare Mike a little bit. He then went back to David's room, and it said David then supposedly started wondering if, like, Alex was going to kill him or, like, kill his brother for real. And he also wondered if maybe he might wake up with Alex standing over him with a knife. So during this same year, 1995, David was growing bored and restless. He was bored with his life. He was constantly fighting with his parents. He continued skipping school. And it was said this year, in particular, David was obsessed with getting money. He wanted to go to Mexico or travel somewhere overseas with his friends. Like, he wanted to do this, like, big adventure, and he wanted money to do it. But, of course, he didn't want to work for anything, of course. So he was thinking of ways that he could get some quick cash without having to work all that hard. So one time, David, Alex, and Sarah were at Denny's hanging out, and David talked about breaking into people's homes and robbing them of valuables as a way to get money. Sarah asked then, well, what would happen if these people woke up? And David said, quote, we'd have to kill them if they could identify us. We couldn't keep any witnesses alive. Yeah, can you, like, these are the conversations that these people are having. But okay. So right after Kimberly graduated in the spring of 1995, she would actually rekindle her relationship with David. She was at Denny's one time in her corner booth smoking, and David and Alex came in, and David saw her, and they, you know, talked to each other. Kimberly tried saying hi to Alex, but he just kind of like looked away, kind of like he was waiting for the waitress or whatever. And so she was like, whatever, fuck you, dude, and decided, you know, just to talk to David that night. And after this night, Kimberly and David started dating again, much to Alex's dismay. He did not like Kimberly. He often called her, quote, dumpy or, quote, ugly bitch. He was resentful of the time David was spending with her. And it really wasn't long before Kimberly was one of many girls fawning over David, doing stuff for him, giving him money. Now, this relationship, though, was more of a fling, and both of them knew it wasn't gonna last. And before long, they were no longer dating. But Kimberly, it was said, was glad to just be friends for David. And then she took on more of like a sisterly, motherly role in his life after this. She was glad they could now be friends, and she would often loan him, you know, money, cigarettes, letting him crash on her couch. David, however, had grown resentful of Kimberly by the time they broke up. And that is because they had broken up without having sex. Kimberly just wasn't kind of like that type of person. Like, if she was gonna have sex, like, she wanted to actually, like, be in a committed, monogamous relationship with someone. So yeah, she didn't sleep around, and she didn't sleep with David, and this pissed him off. He felt he was owed sex, and sometimes he would go off about her. Quote, that dumpy bitch must be a dyke or something. I just want to kill her. And of course, nobody at this time took him seriously. But yeah, this is the kind of person that this asshole is. I mean, look at his background and what he was raised with. Of course, that's how he views women. In September of that year, David and Alex started their sophomore year at Bellevue High School, and David skipped the very first day. One friend of his did have an interesting conversation with him during the fall of that year. It was fellow sophomore Mike Dickinson, and he shared in David's love of tabletops and Dungeons and Dragons and stuff, and the two had actually met in like 8th grade, and so yeah, they were friends, they were buds, they hung out with each other, spent the night at each other's houses. Again, much to Alex's dismay, he did not like anyone who he perceived as taking time away from him and David. But he would never say anything and would just tolerate anyone who David called a friend. So like we said, right, David and Mike were good friends, and they spent the night at each other's houses, and one of these nights, Mike was staying over at David's house. And at this evening, the two had a very disturbing conversation that left Mike, like, kind of scratching his head a little bit. So they were talking, hanging out in David's room, talking about girls they liked, and, you know, like, normal stuff. And then David told Mike about the times that he had slept on the streets or run away from home. But then David locked onto the topic of murder. And it is said it left Mike somewhat shook. David told him, quote, "I've done it before. I've already killed 15 people and I'm going to do it again. A group of us are going to break into our house at night and rob the family. We're going to take their cars and sell them to chop shops to make money. And we're going to take CDs, VCRs, stereo equipment, whatever they've got. We're going to kill anyone inside the house so they can't identify us. We're going to stab them in their arteries, you know, in the heart and neck, so they'll die faster." And at this point, Mike just sort of laughed. Like, he wasn't quite sure if David was being sort of serious, you know. David, he always had this, like, sarcastic demeanor and cadence to his voice, so no one really knew when he was serious and when he was joking. He was also known as sort of like the edgelord in the group, you know, saying things to get a rise out of people. And so, like, Mike is sort of going through all this in his head as David's telling him this stuff. Like, is he just trying to, like, you know, be like an edgelord and just say these things to get a reaction out of me? He wasn't quite sure how to take that. But as David spoke more and more about this plan, he grew more and more excited, talking quicker, you know, as he laid out his plan to Mike. And when Mike had laughed, David said, quote, "I'm serious. I've got the weapons to prove it. Look under the bed." And when Mike reached under the bed, he pulled out 2 bats, an aluminum one and a wooden one. When he reached further under the bed, he pulled out a black nylon knapsack. David told him to open it up. Inside was a butcher knife with a wooden handle and 2 paring knives. David had got into the habit of taking knives from the kitchen and keeping them because he was really all about, like, knives and stuff, and whenever his parents would catch him, they would just take the knives back to the kitchen. David then asked Mike if he wanted in on the plan, and Mike told him, quote, "Hell no." And that's when David just told him, quote, "Well, then don't go blabbing this to anyone, and don't tell Alex." And Mike promised that he wouldn't, but, like, secretly, he was wondering, like, he's just like, "Bro, are you a little, like, cray-cray? Like, what is this? This is so weird and bizarre." A few weeks later, when David and Mike were hanging out at the Ground Zero Teen Center, which was in downtown Bellevue, David told him, they were playing pool, and David told him, quote, "Kim and her family are on the list." And, you know, when Mike asked him to repeat himself, like, "What?" David said, quote, "I said Kim and her family are on the list, you know, to be taken out." And Mike was internally eye-rolling at this point. He was just like, "God, dude, when is he gonna, like, drop this? He's just trying to get a rise out of me and, like, a reaction, and it's just dumb." And he also decided David was probably just posturing at this point. You know, everyone knew that David was pretty angry at Kimberly at this point. He's like, oh, he's just venting about her, and it's just David being David. Also, by this point in time, David was smoking a lot of weed, drinking a lot, cutting class. Like, he was definitely circling the drain a little bit, you know? And so that also added to Mike not really taking David all that seriously. David had even, around this time, convinced a group of friends to come with him to a road trip to Canada. He told them he heard that they could get really good weed in Canada. And so David stole his parents' ATM card. David got one of his friends to take his parents' car. Alex couldn't come because he was grounded. And the teens had a fun road trip all the way up to Canada. They would often stop to pull money out of the ATM. They bought lots of snacks and cigarettes. And of course, when they got to Canada, bought lots of weed. They even went out to eat at restaurants and stayed at a hotel overnight. And all in all, David ended up stealing $1,800 from his parents. And of course, when they found out, Bruce was of course livid, and he demanded that David pay back the money. But a couple of weeks later, David just decided to run away from home. And when he was picked up by the Seattle police, I'm not sure for what, he was brought to CPS due to him being a minor, and when they called his parents up, they would not come to bail him out. So he stayed there, and then while he was still in custody, he admitted to a string of other petty crimes that he had been doing, such as using drugs, stealing from his parents, and other stuff that included like a hit and run and like arson for trying to light a political sign on fire. And I'm not sure what happened with that, if they let him go or what, but because his parents would let him back home, David ended up crashing on friends' couches or just sleeping on in abandoned cars and stuff on the streets. One friend's couch, who he would stay with, was named Bob Boyd, and the other, as we know, was Kimberly. I love how he's like using her couch when he's sitting there actively talking shit about her too. And wanting to be a loyal friend, Alex would sneak out to meet with David and hang out with him. And that's when the two would like prowl the neighborhood, have their pretend fights and all that jazz. By December of that same year, David was back home again, and he was obsessing over this idea of killing someone. Meanwhile, as 1996 began, Kimberly was still taking classes at the community college, but still wasn't quite sure what she wanted to do. She was still arguing with her parents, who thought that she should just focus on school full time. But I just don't understand, it's like if she doesn't know what she wants to do, like, how can she focus on school full time, you know? And yeah, because Kimberly didn't know what she wanted to do, she didn't want to go to college because she didn't want to be stuck at a 4-year, you know, not knowing what she wanted to do. And this is what drew Kimberly to AmeriCorps. She saw it as a way to travel, which, you know, she loved to do, and earn tuition money. And so in the spring of 1996, Kimberly enrolled and was accepted to AmeriCorps. She was going to be moving to San Diego, California, and knowing that she was going to need spending money, Kimberly decided to call up David, her longtime friend whom she had loaned hundreds, if not thousands of dollars to over the years. And she asked him if he could pay back a little bit of what he owed her. David was, of course, outraged and shocked. He thought all of those were just gifts, and he didn't think that he should have to pay back anything. And he even told Kimberly, like, well, you said you'd do anything for me anyway. But in June of that year, Kimberly had pressured David into signing a contract, stating that he would pay her $350 by September of that year. And Julia even signed on as a witness, which I just thought was super funny. It's just like, that wouldn't be enforceable, so I don't know why he signed it. Like, that would not be enforceable. But anyway, so that's what happened. David would later tell friends and anyone who listened that Kimberly had cornered him and pressured him while he was drunk and taken advantage of him, forcing him to sign that contract. He was already struggling to pay back the $1,800 he owed his parents, and there was just no way he was going to come up with the money for Kimberly at the time allotted. And he was also furious at being humiliated. Humiliated, by the way, by a woman who had rejected him, you know, so it really burned him. By this point in time, both David and Alex were unofficial high school dropouts. David stopped attending regular high school and instead was enrolled in the off-campus school alternative program, and Alex also dropped out of Bellevue High and followed David to the off-campus alternative school. At this point, Alex was working laboring jobs, working any job he could get, and he was renting a room from Bob Boyd's parents, Ron and Valerie Boyd. Remember, Bob Boyd was one of David's friends? Alex was renting a room out of their house. So as the next phase of Kimberly's life was beginning, David's was falling apart, and he was growing increasingly obsessive with like wanting a change, a big change. He would often talk to his friends, but especially with Alex and Sarah, about doing, quote, something big for attention. But as he talked more and more about this big something, especially to Sarah and Alex, David divulged more details of what he wanted. Quote, you know who has a lot of property? Kim Wilson and her family. We could break into their home and take the electronics and steal the cars. Well, Alex said that they would make a shitload of money. David added, though, that the, quote, losers never left the house. Quote, we'd have to do it while they were still at home. If they caught us, we'd have to kill them. And there was a pause before Sarah asked, what kind of weapons would they use? Can you imagine, by the way, like, so she has been with Kimberly, if not romantically, at least as a friend, and y'all are sitting here talking about like robbing someone that you actively know in real life. Like, I don't know, I just thought it was super, super bizarre. But anyway, to answer Sarah's inquiry, Alex said, quote, we could use a lamp or a phone, hit the people over the head with that. And they laughed, and the group would continue discussing this plan. But the more that he thought about it, the more David really wanted to make this plan come to fruition. You know, he wanted to do this for real. And nobody believed him at this point, right? Like, none of his friends, nobody believed what he was saying. Like, he was just talking. Not even his string of girlfriends believed him, which he was going through quite a number of at this time. So as we talked about, right, David was a true asshole when it came to women. He would always promise love and devotion and whisper the sweet nothings in their ear to get them. But as soon as they slept with him, like, that was it. Because that's all a relationship boiled down to for David, was sex. And he purposely targeted young, naive, easily manipulated girls, right? Alex said, quote, "He doesn't know what the word love means. It takes him a week to break them down. They just blindly follow him. They turn into sheep, so docile. He told me, I just use women as a wipe rag when I don't want to jack off on myself." Yeah, real lovely, right? So toward the end of 1995/beginning of 1996, David was seeing someone, and her name was Danielle Barry. When she first met, then began dating David, she thought, she had, hit the jackpot. He was good looking, charming, funny, and she was impressed with how many friends David had. But as the weeks passed, she saw the darker side of him. So a few months after they began dating, they were walking around the Woodridge Water Tower Park, which David loved to take girls because he knew that park like the back of his hand, and there's a lot of windy, twisty paths that you can go and find some alone time. So they were walking, and they were talking at first, right? And David started just saying some really, strange, bizarre things that made Danielle quirk an eyebrow. He said, quote, "I'm going to kill someone before I turn 18. I've done some research. I know the laws and how to get around them. If I do it before I turn 18, I'll still be a minor, and so I'll get a lesser sentence. I want to experience the power of killing someone with my own hands. It's going to be very violent. It's going to be a very special murder. I want my victims to feel pain. I want them to experience the pain I felt all my life." He went on to say how he played baseball, so he knew how to use a bat, saying that he intended to use a metal bat so his victims could feel as much pain as humanly possible. He mentioned how much he liked collecting knives, and wanting to change the subject because she was getting increasingly fearful, Danielle brought up something else, and then the conversation meandered to more benign topics. By March of 1996, David told Danielle what he had told so many girls before her, that they were better off as friends, and, oh, we shouldn't be together. And at this point, Danielle was pretty happy, because she was planning on ending things with David anyway. She never told anyone about the things he said, believing that he was just being an angsty teenager. And within only a week of two of dumping Danielle, their friendship certainly hit a bump when David informed Danielle that he was now dating her best friend, Amron Decker. But that didn't last long at all, and during that same month of March, David was seeing yet another girl, this one named Lori Bueller. She was a year older than David and was a senior at Bellevue High. In April, Lori got her first glimpse of the rage that David had. So her, Alex, and David were all in front of David's house, and they were just shooting some hoops. When Kimberly drove up, she wanted to speak to David alone, so they walked off to the side and talked with each other. And when they talked, Kimberly told David that she really needed the money that he owed her. She was going to a concert in Florida in the summer, and so she really needed the $350 that he owed her. It is said at this point, Kimberly was growing very frustrated with David because he hadn't paid her anything, and she threatened to go to his parents if he didn't pony up the dough. So after she left, Lori then asked, oh, who was that? And David was like, oh, that's just my friend. She thinks I owe her money. And Lori's like, well, do you owe her money? And David said, yeah, he did, but it was only $100, for buying Denny's and letting him crash on her couch. At this point, David was seething, and he said, quote, "I'm so mad I could kill her." Alex added that they could kill her and take her car to a chop shop and make some money. And so from that point onward, whenever Kimberly's name was brought up, David grew visibly tense, visibly angry, and upset. His face turned red, clenched his teeth, made fists, he was angry. Another afternoon, when Lori and David were in his room, he was swinging a baseball bat, that imaginary ball, and they were talking. And he told Lori how he knew you could seriously injure someone with a baseball bat. He told her that you could even crack someone's skull. He again brought up the topic of killing someone and spoke about how he already had murder weapons, referring to his baseball bats and knives. By this point, David had taken to wearing a knife in a nylon sheath around his neck, and it was strapped on underneath his shirt, along with brass knuckle duster grips. And additionally, he also wore a combat knife that his father father had given him for his birthday. And he wore that at his waist, on his belt, around his waist. David told Lori about his abusive childhood and levied sexual abuse allegations against his father. Now, it has never been proven or corroborated that Bruce ever sexually molested any of his children, and it is thought that David made this up to get sympathy from his girlfriends. By June, David and Lori had broken up, and then he almost immediately began dating another woman who was divorced and 3 years older than him, and her name was Marcia Joy Rash. It is said at this point David knew he was engaging in empty relationships, but, he knew that he needed comfort from women still, and their money. Marcia even paid David's rent. She was just another girl in his long line of girls that he just used as an ATM machine. It is said at this point in time something had shifted in David, and even he himself had noticed it, chronicling it in a journal. So he wrote, quote, "The flame that I once possessed, emitting from my soul, the flame of friendship, love, compassion, caring, and happiness, is now gone. I once possessed a great flame that spread warmth and a knowing light to all those who were close enough to me to receive the light. But now it's gone. I don't even know how long it's been gone. My attention strayed to petty pleasures and meaningless relationships. I see myself walking my own path of darkness and light. I see people fall to my touch of ecstasy, and I see people fall to my charming smile of friendship. And I wonder which of those smiles I have feigned and which ones are true." At the same time, Alex, David, and Sarah continued their discussions of how they would rob people and then murder them. Now, the book states that it never once occurred to Sarah that what they were discussing was real. I'm not sure why you would, again, even be discussing this about people you know in real life and interact with, but whatever. Now, during one time in the spring of 1996, Sarah did let it slip to Kimberly what the three of them had been discussing. And of course, Kimberly was extremely upset. And shortly after Sarah had told her this, Kimberly had run into David and she went off on him. Now, the book says that it's likely David just laughed it off, but inside was probably really angry. We do know that after this confrontation, David did call up Sarah and berated her for, telling Kimberly about their plans. Meanwhile, by the summer of that year, Alex had grown more confident in his body and around girls. He had grown into his looks more. He didn't feel quite as awkward as he once did. And remember, we mentioned this earlier, girls in the Denny's Club thought he was cute too. And when David dumped Lori, Alex saw this as an opportunity to perhaps get a girlfriend. So one time, Lori was over and she was sprawled out on Alex's bed, and Alex was on the floor flipping through a magazine. And Alex's stepmother, Mary Beth, came downstairs to do laundry. And probably because she's a snoopy little twit with nothing else better to do, she decided to spy in on her stepson. And all she could see was through a little crack in the door, and all she saw was Lori sprawled out on Alex's bed. And then she hurried up the stairs to tattle to Alex Sr. about what Alex was doing. And of course, Alex and Lori heard her go up the stairs, and so Alex, led Lori out through the basement door and went upstairs to figure out, okay, how much trouble am I in now? When he went up there, his father reminded him that he wasn't supposed to have girls in his bedroom. Alex said they weren't doing anything. Now, Alex claims after he insisted they weren't doing anything, his father got angry and lunged at him. We don't know. That's just what Alex says. But what we do know is that Alex did become angry and kicked his father in the stomach and side, shouting, "Die, motherfucker." Mary Beth threatened to call the cops if the two didn't stop, and Alex went downstairs, packed a quick bag, and called up David to come get him, which he did. When they got to David's home, Alex explained to David's father about what had happened, asked if he could stay there. Bruce just said, "Okay, you can stay one night and that's it, but you need to go home and reconcile with your father." That night, Bruce called Alex Sr., asking what happened, and once Alex Sr. explained, Bruce told him, quote, "I've raised 4 boys. I've been through this. They grow up and think they can do whatever they want, but they learn. You guys need to get back together. I don't know if I'd be too keen taking parenting advice from a guy where 3 out of his 4 sons dropped out of high school and moved out of the house before they were 18 years old, but that's just me." So the next morning, Alex was dropped off at home. His dad was waiting for him in the kitchen, and he, had tears in his eyes and was like, "Oh, son, you're the only son I have," calling him Kevin, by the way, still calling him Kevin, and, saying that he loved him, and Alex just wasn't buying any of it. He rolled his eyes and just said whatever and headed back downstairs to his room. Alex and David continued spending every minute with each other. David spoke about how cool it would be to travel around and get paid to kill people. He was really into the whole mercenary scene. And remember, that was a class of character that he chose to play often, so he's really into it. He wondered what it would like to be a soldier of misfortune and just go around killing people. He then asked Alex what he thought it would be like to kill someone for money, to which Alex said he didn't know. So David said, quote, well, why not kill someone you don't like? Now to this, Alex actually agreed, because he could think of quite a few people he would love to kill that he didn't like, with his father topping that list. But that's when David said, what about Kim Wilson? David thought she was the perfect candidate. And like Sarah, Alex claims that he didn't think David was really serious, especially when David began discussing the murder in terms of D&D and tabletop games. Quote, let's say there's this game, Dungeons and Dragon-esque. What would happen if this dragon had stolen something from you? You'd want to slay the dragon. So, if Kim is the dragon-esque, we would have to kill her. And Alex agreed, saying that, yeah, I'd help you. And that's when David wrapped his arm around Alex's neck and told him, quote, you and I have an understanding. We'll always be friends. And they continued walking, talking about their plot to murder the Wilsons. And again, David framing it in terms of like a role-playing game. Now, as the summer wore on, David became increasingly excited at the prospect of murdering Kimberly and her family. He would literally go red anytime anyone brought up her name. He was that angry and resentful of her. One afternoon, he told Alex, quote, you know, Alex, this is something that could be done in real life. We could do this for real. We could lure Kim out of her house, to a park or someplace where there's no phone. We gotta get her where there are no houses, no lights, no cars coming by. We would kill her and dump her out in Issaquah or somewhere in the mountains over there. Then we would go to her house and kill her family and take their cars and VCR and stuff like that. Alex said as usual, he went along with what David said because he felt that he owed David like some sort of loyalty. David was his only friend. Had always been there for him, had introduced him to a larger social circle. And, as far as Alex saw it, it was, thanks to David that he was even able to enter the dating scene at all. But most importantly, right, the book points out, David was the one constant in Alex's very turbulent, unstable life, right? And that meant a lot to him. Quote, he made me feel like he and I were soulmates. I believed it. I was an immature kid. What the hell did I know? He was my only friend. And this was according to Alex. By that summer, David had moved out of his parents' house and had rented an apartment with his brother Mike and Marcia in the Seattle suburb of Renton. And at this point, remember, Alex was renting a room out of the Boyds' house. It is said the Boyds actually enjoyed having Alex around. They thought he was very polite and tidy and a hard worker. And Alex liked living over at the Boyds because it felt like living with a family, something that he had never experienced living with his father and stepmother. So with David owing his parents and Kimberly money, he got a job at Right Way Waterproofing in Seattle. And he was a day laborer, and in October of that same year, he also got Alex a job there, where Alex would work 40 to 60-hour weeks. Alex was usually the first to arrive to work and the last to leave, because he had to rely on Marcia to take him to and from work. David, as usual, would only go to work when he felt like, and Marcia would drive them both on those days. And Alex would usually be dropped off at 7 a.m. and picked up at 7 p.m. every day. And the same month that David got Alex a job there, David was actually fired for, not showing up to work. Now, on the surface, it looked like Alex's life was actually on the upturn. He had a job, a place that he didn't dread to live or go to, and he had a social circle of sorts thanks to David. But the book states that inside, Alex was still very angry and still very emotional, and he retreated further and further into that fantasy world he had concocted. He even began practicing with real swords. That's how, immersed he became. He would often swing at multiple targets in his room, so there was big gouges in the walls and furniture. He had a cardboard cutout of Mel Gibson in Braveheart. That was his favorite movie and his favorite actor, and he ended up slicing the head off of that when he was swinging his sword around. The book says that inside, as he was practicing swinging the sword, Alex would think about those he would actually like to hurt and kill as he was swinging it, including, Mike, because he was with Sarah. Actually, the whole Anderson family, including David. Kimberly also, but most especially his father. His father held the #1 spot of hatred in Alex's heart. It is said even David began side-eyeing Alex a little bit and this dark behavior he was exhibiting. A few years after they had initially met and the plan to murder the Wilsons was being concocted and talked about, David had written about his supposed fears of Alex and what the book goes out of its way to describe as neat penmanship on a blank white sheet of paper. And he wrote, quote, I do not trust him. I have every cause to fear him as much as he should fear me. but we are the best of friends, or so he pretends. Possibly he's trying to do the same thing to me as I will do to Kim. At times I think that our friendship will last forever, and then there are those times when he talks about his ambitions and about Rose. I try to keep myself from laughing, and when I think back on it, I think that he is totally insane, and I wonder who I've been talking to for the past 3 years. I feel like his friendship to me is like a flame from a candle, starting out with just a spark of life, then growing and staying constantly strong, bright, warm, and melting all the waxy problems of life. Then the flame flickers and sometimes goes out altogether, but always the flame was lit again, and again constantly strong, bright, and warm. But this time, the wick is not as long, the flame not quite as strong, and I sometimes find myself wondering when the wick will run out, or when the flame won't be relit. I also wonder, who is the monster? Is it him? Is it me? Or are we just children playing a child's game while waiting to grow up? It never hurts to wonder, but I'm very careful on which actions I choose to take for my decisions based on my wonderings. But, as you can tell from that musing, right, it wasn't just Alex that was sort of inwardly spiraling down this, dark path. David was still entertaining and fantasizing about killing Kimberly and her family, and much like Alex, he began retreating into himself a bit as well. Both boys even dropped out of the Denny scene, having both just grown, frustrated and irritable with their friends. And then, before they knew it, Kimberly had hopped off on a plane to San Diego and she was gone. Without collecting a dime from David, by the way. And as soon as she was gone, David stopped talking about her altogether. The plan to kill her and her family disappeared, and he didn't bring it up again. On November 14th, 1996, David officially dropped out of high school, and 4 days later, Alex followed him. So now let's get into the case, all right? The events of the case, all right? So Kimberly, was chilling, living her life in San Diego, and she came back to Bellevue to visit her family for the holidays of 1996, for Christmas and New Year's. She flew in on December 20th, 1996, and was slated to fly back home on Sunday, January 5th, 1997. So back home, Kimberly caught up with all kinds of childhood friends and high school friends, including her childhood best friend, Claire Hearn. Claire had known the Wilsons since they had first moved to Bellevue, and she and Kimberly were extremely close. They met in grade school. And in fact, Claire was so close to the Wilson family that she was allowed to just walk into the home. She didn't have to knock or anything. That's how close she was with them. And it should also be noted that, the reason she was able to just walk into their home is the Wilsons, a lot of people in the neighborhood, didn't keep their doors locked. They had an open door policy. So Claire and Kimberly met up on the morning of January 3rd, 1997. That was a Friday morning. And they caught up with breakfast and they ended up, chatting and whatnot. They ended their breakfast by saying that they would catch up with each other the next day on Saturday if both of them were free. And this would be the last time that Claire would speak with her friend Kimberly. Afterwards, Kimberly headed to her old high school. She wanted to thank some teachers for their guidance and whatnot and just kind of, show them that she was in a better place. And she was. Kimberly was thriving in AmeriCorps. She had decided that she did want to go to college. And she was really glad that she had joined AmeriCorps because it really gave her a sense of direction. And this, of course, thrilled her parents, especially Rose. After she was done at the high school, Kimberly met up with another friend, Nanda Prabhakar. I hope that's how you say her name. And they saw the movie One Fine Day. And they went to a cinema near the Factoria Mall. Meanwhile, at work, Rose was bouncing around the office, right? She was just glad that, Kimberly had finally decided on direction of her life. And she was just relieved. And on the same Friday, 17-year-old Julia, who was a senior at Bellevue High School, got her acceptance letter to the Catholic College Western Washington University, and that was located in Ellensburg. She also worked part-time doing clerical work at a Bellevue law firm, and, when she got her acceptance letter, she phoned up her mom, who of course was super ecstatic, and told her mom, hey, I'm gonna go celebrate with some friends for dinner tonight, so I won't be home for dinner tonight. And that's exactly what she did. Bill, meanwhile, worked his normal shift at his job, and afterwards he picked up Rose's mother, Julia Mahoney. She wanted to take Kimberly out to dinner before she left town, and that's exactly what the family did. That same night, around 9 p.m., after getting back from a walk with a high school friend, her name was Erin Gauntlet, another friend and former girlfriend of Kimberly's stopped by to hang out with her. Her name was Sky Stewart, who was also a member of the Denny's Club, and it was actually thanks to Kimberly that Sky went back and got her high school diploma. So Sky stopped by Kimberly's because Kimberly was going to hang out with her as she ran some errands that night. They headed to Best Electronics store so Sky could pick up an alarm clock. Then they went to the shopping center so Sky could pay some bills. And then they finally went to McDonald's for a snack. Afterwards, they then headed to Denny's in Issaquah to see if they could meet up with some friends. Kimberly was hoping to run into a particular friend there. The two hung out there at a booth, smoking cigarettes, hanging out, and they hung out there for about 45 minutes. And that's when they decided to call it a night. Kimberly's friend had never shown up, and even though it was only 10 o'clock or so, Sky wanted to go hang out with her boyfriend, and Kimberly had to pack the next day. She was getting ready to leave to fly back home, so they decided to call it a night. Or excuse me, it was about 10:30 p.m. So Sky drove Kimberly home, dropped her off around 11, and Kimberly promised to call her the next day, but unfortunately, Kimberly wouldn't, and this would be the last time that Sky would ever see Kimberly. On the same evening of Friday, January 3rd, 1997, David stopped by the Boyd residence to see Alex. David normally borrowed Marcia's tan VW Rabbit, but it was in the shop, so Marcia had borrowed her stepfather's black pickup truck, so that's what David was driving around in. When David showed up, Bob was in Alex's room playing video games. They were just hanging out. And Bob asked the boys if they were going to go to the Sun Villa Lanes. There was some event like a rock and bowl night, and a lot of people were going to be there, and Bob wondered if they were going to stop by. David said that they were not going to be going. They would be going to Renton, and they'd be going to a restaurant, Denny's or some other restaurant. After Alex got his trench coat and some money, the two left the Boyd residence together. They hopped on the 405 freeway and headed to Renton, where they went to the restaurant Sherry's. But before they went inside, and when he was still parking, David told Alex that Kimberly was in town. Quote, "Why don't we do the stuff tonight?" And of course, Alex knew exactly what David was referring to. And he was puzzled why David was bringing the subject up now, especially because Kimberly had been in town for a while, The boys got out, went inside. After getting their drinks, Alex thought maybe David would drop the subject and they'd move on to something else, but he didn't. Quote, "So let's do it tonight." And that's what David insisted. And Alex just replied, quote, "I don't particularly want to." And this is when, irritated, David replied, quote, "If you don't want to help, I'll fucking do it myself. Come on, we've been talking about this forever. We're best friends. We stick together. Blood brothers, remember?" Alex, of course, bought this guilt trip, hook, line, and sinker. And then he asked David what he needed him to do. Quote, "I'll get Kim out of the house and make her come with me to the park. You wait at the water tower behind some bushes until I bring Kim over. Then I'll stop. You jump out and pull the rope around her neck and garrote her." Alex claims he still didn't buy that David was totally serious at this point, but he just told him okay. David then stepped outside to use the payphone, and he called up Kimberly. A few moments later, he came back to the table and asked Alex if he was ready to go. He was, and so the two left, headed for Bellevue. And just as Alex was thinking, what would happen if we got caught, David reiterated the plan to him. Quote, "I'll drop you off at the park, and you wait there while I go get Kim. Use a rope. I want to make sure it's quiet." And it is said at that moment, Alex knew that David was serious. On the way there, David stopped by Radio Shack to pick up Marcia from work and then dropped her off at home. Then the two headed back to the Boyd residence to get their supplies. The book states that though it was never proved, it was thought that David had moved all of his weapons to Alex's room at this point. Around 10 p.m., the boys walked out to the truck, stashing their weapons, making multiple trips. And this annoyed Bob's Aunt Christine Boyd, who was also in the house, and she was trying to watch 2020. And she was really irritated that the boys were stomping in and out of the house, going back and forth. She peeked out of the blinds to see what they were up to, and she saw, Alex walking kind of, stiffly with his arm. And it's because he had, a weapon in the sleeve of his jacket. She would later say at that moment, quote, "Damn boys, they're up to no good." So the two lingered around the truck, smoking cigarettes, hanging out, waiting till later to make sure that everyone at the Wilson home would be asleep. And at about 11 p.m. they left. They arrived at the park. Both of them got out, and they walked up one of the gravel trails, about 30 yards off the main trail. Or 30 yards into the park. And they came near a tangle of bushes. David told Alex to wait there while he went and got Kimberly, and then he left to go pick her up. About 5 minutes later, Alex heard the sound of a car pulling into the parking lot, and then it turning off, and 2 car doors slamming. It was just after midnight. Kimberly got out and sat on the hood of the truck, and the two talked and smoked cigarettes for a while. Then David asked Kimberly if she would like to go for a walk. Of course she would. She got off the truck and they started walking towards the entrance in the park. And as they walked to the park, they walked side by side, but as they entered the park, David got in front of Kimberly. As they approached where Alex was hiding with a rope, David, still walking in front of Kimberly, glanced over to where he knew Alex was hiding and signaled him that it was time. So Alex leapt out from behind Kimberly, shouting, and Kimberly turned around, startled, and recognized Alex. She breathed a sigh of relief and just said, quote, "You scared me," and and then turned around to continue walking. And now David and both Alex were behind her. But David then stepped off the path, and that's when Alex moved in closer. He came up behind Kimberly and strangled her with the rope, while David repeatedly beat and stomped her, and they would do this until she died. Once they had concealed Kimberly's body in the park in some bushes, they feared that her family knew where she was and who she was going to meet, so they decided they knew they were going to have to kill the family as well. Alex and David drove near the Wilson home, and they waited there for about an hour. They then drove to the home, parked, and just waltzed in to the unlocked front door. Once inside the family home, the family's golden retriever, Mo, started barking. Alex later admitted that he felt, quote, scared when the dog started barking, that they thought this was it, but Bill ended up quieting the dog and shushing him and went back to his room and to bed. After the dog quieted down, the boys headed up the stairs, and they crept into Rose's and Bill's room. And as soon as they were in there, they began beating Rose, who was only 46 years old, with the baseball bat. The commotion, of course, awoke Bill, who was 52, and he immediately went to his wife's defense, but the boys then turned on him and stabbed and beat him as well. They then turned back to Rose, stabbed her some more, until she too was dead. Julia, who remember was 17, was actually already awake and was in her room studying for a chemistry test when she heard the commotion, and when she stepped out of her room to look into the hallway to see what the commotion was, she was met with David and Alex, who also stabbed and beat her to death. Later, the next day on Saturday, January 4th, 12-year-old Nathan Keach and his 3 friends, Robbie, Travis, and Yuri, were walking through Water Tower Park. They were walking one of the familiar trails, and they were on their way to Robbie's house, right? And they were walking in a single file line with Nathan in the very back. The boys came to a short flight of stairs, and just as Nathan, who remember was the last one, descended the stairs, he looked over and noticed a patch of bright blue in the shrubbery. And of course, this really stood out, like amongst all the forestry and stuff, right? It was about 5 feet off the trail. And when Nathan got to the last step, he took a closer look, and he thought that it looked like a pile of clothes. Maybe it was like a homeless person sleeping or something. Nathan got the boys' attention, and they all looked, and they all wondered what it was that they were looking at. Nathan shouted at the person if they were okay, seeing if maybe they would stir or whatever. I mean, it was the dead of winter, it was cold, but no response came. So the other boys were like, oh, I think it's just a dressed up mannequin. And so Nathan was like, yeah, you're right. And so though they were still curious, they proceeded to Robbie's house. Meanwhile, on that same day, Claire ran errands, hung out with some friends, and around 4 p.m., she decided to see if Kimberly was free. She wanted to say goodbye since Kimberly was going to leave the next day on Sunday. So she walked to the Wilson home, noticed the cars in the driveway, and she thought it was weird that the cars were all parked in the exact same position as, when she had passed by the home earlier. So that was a little weird. An uneasy feeling crept over her, and Claire said, instead of just waltzing into the house as she normally did, something told her not to just barge into the house at this point in time, and so she knocked on the door. Of course, no one answered, and as she rang the doorbell, the family's dog, Mo, came around the corner, and, he was whimpering and frantically wagging his tail coming up to her, and Claire thought this was very strange, because Rose never let her dog out off-leash. He was older, he had just had hip surgery, and so she thought, well, maybe they're in the neighborhood and Mo just escaped, So she decided, you know what, I'll just hang out at the house, I'll wait for Kimberly or someone to come home and keep an eye on Mo. After waiting about a half hour, she was worried that the dog hadn't eaten, so she walked back to her house and got some dry cat food for the dog to eat. As it began to get dark, she plugged in the family's Christmas lights to an outdoor socket that they had. And finally, after another hour passed with nobody arriving, Claire decided that she would have to go home and she would have to say goodbye to Kimberly over the phone. The next day, on Sunday, January 5th, Claire was curious about Kimberly, and she wondered if maybe her parents were going to drive her to the airport. So she drove by the Wilson home and noticed that it was in the exact same condition in which she had left it the previous day. She thought this was super odd. So odd that she decided to call up Sky and see if she had seen Kimberly. Sky had not. She's like, no, I just saw her Friday. I've been trying to get a hold of her all weekend as well. Nobody is answering. Meanwhile, that same morning, Nathan and his friend Yuri returned to the park because they wanted to see if that patch of blue was still in the bushes. It hadn't moved at all. They thought it was strange that no one had collected like this mannequin, if that's what it was. And as they stopped off the trail to get a closer look at what they were looking at, they noticed a human hand sticking out from underneath the pile of clothes. They crouched down to get a better look about a yard away, and that's when they realized they were looking at a dead human body. Staying away in case the person was alive, possibly injured, Nathan grabbed a tree branch from nearby and started smacking the ground, like, hey, are you okay? Seeing if the body would react at all. and there was no reaction. So getting no response, Nathan then decided to poke the hand with the branch. Because if it was like a firm, surface, okay, it's a mannequin. But if it was soft, it's probably a body, right? As we know, it was soft. They stared for 1 second more to see if maybe the body would move, like to show that someone was breathing or whatever, but they didn't. So after that, they rushed to Nathan's home to alert his mom, Susan Matney, who was in the middle of doing laundry when the boys burst in and telling her that they had found a dead body in the park. They talked about a man that they had found because they couldn't really tell with the clothes, so they just assumed it was a man, So Susan then gathered up the boys, had them, show her where they had found this. She had the boys stay at the top of the stairs as she proceeded down, and as she descended and made her way closer to the patch of blue, she could tell that it was a person. They were face down, and their left arm was twisted behind their back. Susan crept closer and kept asking aloud, hey, are you okay? Can you hear me? As she got closer, no response. She got close enough to touch the wrist to check for a pulse. There was none. It was ice cold. And so that's when she shouted for the boys to run back home and call 911, which they did, and Susan stayed with the body. She got closer and noticed that it was in fact a woman that was there with blonde hair. She brushed the hair aside, didn't recognize Kimberly. She checked for a pulse on the woman's neck. There was none. And she then noticed a checkbook sticking out from the woman's pocket. So she decided to take it and see who it is that she had found. And of course, as we know, it said Kimberly Wilson and that she lived in San Diego, California. And Susan had no idea who she was. By that time, Susan heard voices of neighbors, and she shouted at them to call 911 as well, that there was a dead body. And the Bellevue police dispatchers would receive the call at 11 a.m. that Sunday. So the first detective appeared on scene, Detective Jerry Johnson, and he determined it was the body, in fact, of a young woman. He immediately raided for backup, and Detective Robert Thompson got the page. He arrived at the park just before noon, noticed his colleagues had only roped off the part of the park where the body was, which annoyed him, because they should have cleared the entire park and shut it down. So that's exactly what he proceeded to do. They also retrieved the checkbook that Susan had found. And at first glance, Detective Thompson thought perhaps this was a suicide, seeing as how the body was fully clothed and it didn't look to have been outwardly assaulted at first glance. But when the King County medical examiner, Kathy Raven, appeared on scene and medical investigator Arley Marquis showed up on scene, they turned Kimberly over and Thompson immediately took back his suicide cause of death theory. Wrapped tightly in a double knot around Kimberly's neck was a piece of braided rope about 1/4 of an inch thick. Quote, I remember looking in the tree thinking, I hope there's a rope broken off someplace to explain this. When there wasn't, I'm thinking, this is a homicide. Wrapped and tangled within the rope were 2 necklaces, and it would later be discovered that the rope was wound so tightly around Kimberly's neck, it had caused the blood vessels in her eyes to pop, dotting the whites of her eyes with red dots. The pathologist would later determine that Kimberly had died of asphyxiation, had most likely lost consciousness after about 10 seconds, and had been dead within 4 minutes of being strangled. Thompson immediately phoned in fellow detective Jeff Gomez. Quote, some kids found a body at a park in Woodridge. This one's yours. Apparently it's common for police departments to rotate who's the lead detective in different cases, even though they all work on it together, and it was Detective Gomez's turn to head this investigation. Also called to the crime scene was King County prosecutor Patricia Eakes. And this was actually part of a newer program that had been established in the county in 1995. The program was called the Most Dangerous Offender Project, the MDOP, and it decrees that whenever there's a homicide in King County, MDOP prosecutors would converge on the scene with police. There were about 6 of them, and they are there to get a better understanding of the case. They're there to sort of observe, get a better, knowledge and understanding of what happened at the crime scene, as opposed to just looking through, reports and pictures and stuff. Now, they're not allowed to interview witnesses without a detective present. And if they see any evidence, prosecutors have to alert detectives and not touch it at all. But yeah, it was part of this program. King County Senior Deputy Prosecutor Jeff Beard said of the program, quote, it helps us present a case to the jury in a more effective way. I think it's improved our practice greatly. And Beard would actually end up assisting Eakes on this case. So the detectives surveyed Kimberly's body, noticing that though her clothes were dirty, they weren't ripped, but they were slick with moisture because of the rainy, wet weather they were having. So obviously she had been out here for a couple days at least. She was wearing a University of Washington Huskies shirt, sweatshirt specifically, over a blue plaid t-shirt, blue jeans, hiking boots, with a brown leather belt. And it had a small leather loop for where a wallet should be, but there was no wallet found. There were no signs of a struggle around other than the black and blue bruises that were all over Kimberly. They were all over her face, and it looked as if someone had beat her with a blunt, heavy object. She had multiple abrasions, bruises, and scrapes over her cheeks, eyes, nose, and on the left side of her chin. There were also several areas where her skin had rubbed off, though authorities had a tough time determining like what had been caused by the attack and what had been caused by like animals and stuff. She had multiple internal injuries as well, including 3 fractured ribs, a torn kidney, and spleen, which the pathologist would later determine could only have come from extreme brute force. In fact, Kimberly's entire upper body had been completely crushed, and it would later be determined that the amount of force to cause these sort of injuries is the same as being in a car that hits a wall at 30 miles an hour. The fact that she had bleeding internally also indicated to professionals that Kimberly had been alive when she had received these physical blows. They ran Kimberly's name through the database to see, you know, if she was local, if she had family local, and of course, the Wilson address popped up. And so seeing that the family's address wasn't very far away, Detective Gomez and Prosecutor Eakes decided to head over to the Wilson home, as did Marquis and Raven with Kimberly's body in their ME van. And that is where we will stop part 1 of the Bellevue murders. Isn't that awful? Like, so much setup because we've got like quite a few players, you know, we've got a whole family of victims and we've got 2 perpetrators, so there was a lot to get into. Plus I like getting into, you know, everyone involved in this, like getting the relationship. Who are these people? Because like these are people that we're talking about, right? Like it's easy when you sit there and read something in like a newspaper or blog or whatever to think of it as characters in a story. But like, no, these are like real life people. Like this is something that happened to real life people, you know? And it's bizarre and bonkers. We're gonna get into a lot of weird stuff next week. We'll get into, the investigation, the trials, and because I have, you know, been absent for so long, next week I will post part 2, and then I'll go back to like the every 2 week schedule. And I am sorry so much for, you know, dipping this whole year. I've just had a lot of medical issues that I've been trying to navigate and take care of. Nothing, you know, super serious or anything. But, you know, as anyone who navigates this joke of a system we call a healthcare system in this country can attest to, it is very draining. Physically, emotionally, financially, and so I haven't been in the best headspace to do this, and so we've also had some personal stuff going on with our families that has just been sort of very stressful, so that is why I haven't been back. I just haven't really felt it, so things are better now, getting stuff taken care of, so hopefully I can be back now, alright? Back to it. Assuming there's anybody left. I was gone for a while. But next week we'll be back with part 2. We'll wrap up this case, and then after next week I will be going back to the 2-week release schedule. And again, thank you so much to @HeyHeyYou for the suggestion of this case. This is a bonkers one. Don't you guys feel a little sad for Alex? I definitely feel a little sad for him. Like, well, I'll get into my thoughts next week when we conclude this case. But man, it's just really shows how so many people can fail one person and that ends up having like a ripple effect that, you know, affects so many other people. Well, anyway, thank you so much for hanging out with me and our first episode back of 2024. Hopefully nothing else happens. Famous last words. So until we meet again next week, have a wonderful, safe, happy week out there. Remember, don't be a douche nozzle when you're out there. Just try to be decent. Remember, like, most of the people that you're interacting with on a day-to-day basis are not the reason why you're miserable, you know? So don't take it out on innocent people. Remember, leave a little sparkle wherever you go, you know? Because that's all it takes. It's just someone being nice to one person, and that can have such a ripple effect, you know? It sounds corny, but it's totally true. Alrighty, guys, I will sign off now, and I will see you next week for part 2. Have a wonderful week. Bye-bye.